Hello, welcome. I'm Kim Denyas. I'm a spiritual director, and I am talking about what is a spiritual director, who is a spiritual director, who needs to go, what happens in that space. So, what is a spiritual director? It's kind of a strange ministry, actually. Even the title, spiritual director, that word sounds a bit off-putting perhaps. So you might hear people call spiritual directors also spiritual companions, spiritual friend, advisor. Any of those can be used. It's not really a professional ministry, yet it's ancient in its practice. It dates back to perhaps 2,500 years before Christ. It's less known in Protestant circles than it is in Roman Catholic circles, yet our Mennonites, brothers and sisters, they ordain their spiritual directors. And for the most part, the ministry is a bit outside the church building. Yet when a pastor or vicar engages in spiritual direction, they, as Angela Reed writes, can invite the entire congregation into a new and expanded way of walking with God. This is the book I'm referring to by Angela Reed. She's a wonderful writer and a wonderful woman of God and a spiritual director. She's her PhD, and this is the outcome of that. So, I want to talk about what is a spiritual director. How does it differ? Let's do a little bit of differ from the pastoral counseling or the pastoral care piece. And also, why is it not like therapy? Because it isn't therapy. So, Marcus Smucker, a lovely man of God who's gone to be with God, says that it is distinctive from pastoral counseling in that the particular focus is upon the directee, that's the client, the directee's relationship with God, rather than human problem solving. And as I said before, spiritual directors are not there to fix your life. They're not there to advise or suggest or mandate anything. They are there to listen. They are there to journey with you and God. Now, if you went to a therapist, how is it different from therapy? Is often the question I get. A therapist is working for a diagnosis. He and she meets with you to discover what is, if you will, wrong, what needs to be tended to within you psychologically. As a spiritual director, that's not what we do. We don't work for a diagnostic position in your life. We're listening for the move of God. So, and that's it. We are deeply trained, and we practice being listeners for the holy, for where God's moving. Imagine it's kind of like going to your medical professional, and he or she listening to your heart and lungs, and having you breathe. A spiritual director listens to your words, your stories, your life experiences. They want to know what brings you anger and joy, and they listen for where you're free and where you're attached, where you're hooked, what's life-giving, what's not life-giving. We listen for your heart's longing about walking with God, about your family, about yourself. How do you want to live with that? Also, spiritual directors tend to be, for the most part, men and women who are contemplative. Now, what do I mean by contemplative? Well, it's a great word to look up, but it's also, so for example, one of the things that I was deeply trained in when I was at Moravian Seminary was that contemplative dialogue means that no word's the last word. I don't have all the answers, nor do you, but we listen with an ear towards connection, towards deeper understanding. So a contemplative person has some of that gift. I would say one of the markers is someone who engages in some type of meditative stillness, quiet prayer, some type of being with God beyond asking and needing anything from God except God's presence. So one of the very popular ways of doing this is a practice called centering prayer. It came out of the Roman Catholic tradition. Thomas Keating brought it forward. There have been many that have now brought it forward to the Protestants. But again, that's something you could look up, do a little research on. But centering prayer is a lovely practice, a lovely place to begin. Contemplative people tend to have some type of practice like that in their lives. They have spent time with the holy, quieting their own monkey mind, because we all have one, and listening for the divine. Spiritual directors have a deep commitment to their personal journey with God. I have my own spiritual director. I value my time with him. I lean on him for his insights that maybe I won't see. And that's also part of who I am as a spiritual director, and who most spiritual directors are. They really are. We are encouraged that if we are spiritual directors, to be in spiritual direction for ourselves. Marcus Smucker makes a beautiful list that I want to share with you. He says the director, the spiritual director, I love these verbs, encourages the hearing of God's word. Now that could be reading it, that could be hearing it in a sermon, that could be you're quieting yourself enough to have God bring back something maybe you learned as a child or heard in a sermon. The spiritual director observes the movements of God. They facilitate. That word can mean simplify, we aid, we maybe even help enable the awareness and the responsiveness to God. They can function as a confessor. This one is very holy to me. Again, as a Protestant, we didn't go to confession, and yet something happens. We know that from the New Testament. Something happens when we confess our weaknesses, confess those areas where we're getting hooked or stumbling to one another. The writer James says that when that happens, when we confess those weaknesses, we are healed. And I do believe, I have seen it, I've experienced it, that there can be healing. It's that slow, barely perceptible kind of healing. It's not magic. It's that slow, steady work of God in our lives. So the spiritual direction can participate in that with you. They're going to be one that encourages spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, if you will. I told you in one of my videos about my spiritual director early on asking me to be last. And that became a spiritual practice. It's become a spiritual insight now for me. If I'm pushing myself too far forward, might I step back? Might God be asking that? And lastly, a spiritual director provides a means of accountability. And that accountability comes richly seasoned with hospitality. The hospitality can be physical, it can be energetically given, and it can also most definitely be spiritually attuned to. So who might benefit from spiritual direction? Well, the short list is all of us. All of us. I have said that when ministers get into spiritual direction, the whole church can benefit. So certainly our ministers and lay leaders, men and women that are volunteering at the church, in the choir, those types of things. And really anyone who is seeking to know themselves and know God in some richness. And I believe that richness happens when we're with one another. That's what Jesus talks about. When 2 or 3 are gathered, God shows up. God does show up in spiritual direction with great regularity. So I started thinking, since we've been talking about the Bible and talking specifically about the Old Testament, who in the Bible might have benefited from spiritual direction? Well, if I look at the Old Testament, 3 names pop up. David, King David. He misuses power. A spiritual director might have been beneficial there. He has a prophet who speaks to his life gorgeously, so that was taken care of. Also Jonah. If you know the story of Jonah, he is called to go to basically his enemy's city to preach the word of God. And he doesn't do any discernment or any checking. He just heads the opposite direction. So Jonah might have benefited from a spiritual director. A couple women that come to mind. The first one is Hannah from the Old Testament. Hannah's barren, and she gives birth to a son. God miraculously opens her womb, and she promises that son to God. She releases him at about 3 years old to live with the priest, the high priest, who's not really a very good high priest. And I would imagine that took a fair amount of trust or surrender And that's great stuff for a spiritual director to walk with you and keep you in tune there, keep you lined up with God. And then I got thinking about Mary, got thinking about some New Testament people. And certainly Mary, the mother of Jesus, could have been one that maybe she even experienced spiritual direction. So after she's told she's pregnant, she goes to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's a little bit older than she is, and she's a little bit further along with her pregnancy than Mary is. The text seems to reveal that Mary stays about 3 months, almost like a retreat, a spiritual retreat. I've often wondered how that might have grounded her for what was to come, what her life was to be. I mean, she was going to stand at his death, at his horrific death. She was going to watch that, and how that time might have just settled her, hardened her, if you will, opened her up to it with Elizabeth's wisdom. That can be the gift of a spiritual director right there. And then there was one more that crossed my mind. Oh, it's actually a group of women. We find them in Luke 8. And they don't get much recognition. They get maybe 2 sentences. But we know that they financially support the work of Jesus. Have you ever thought about that? How did Jesus actually do what he did? Where was he being fed, and who was taking care of those financial needs? Luke 8, I think it's about 32nd verse, maybe 38, 32, I think. We see a little tiny list of women that were financially supporting Jesus. And I think of them, I wonder how they did as they went through their lives. They'd have given their money to increase his ministry, to support him, and then he's killed as a criminal. Did they doubt? Did they wonder what happened? Did they long to know more than they could know? Were they being invited to surrender into such a deep trust that there's hardly words? That's where a spiritual director can help. So then I was thinking, what kind of topics come into the room? So I've given you a few examples there with those people, but what other topics have I seen come to me in the past 10 years? Discernment. That is a huge one. Sometimes people come for like 3 to 6 sessions and just want to discern really between 2 excellent choices. Another one is a death of a dream, what I call the death of a dream. My father used that language. I can remember it. So a death of a dream is, let's say you dreamt you'd be a mom. Your whole life you thought you'd have a couple children. And you get married and you fall in love and you cannot conceive. And so that death comes, that death of a dream of being pregnant, of delivering children, that dies. Now, it doesn't mean another dream doesn't come, right? Doesn't mean adoption's not on the table or something else. But that time where the dream is dying is where we really need one another. Another one that I call the testing of a call. So you feel called to do something, maybe go to seminary, become a minister, and you get there and it's a horrific experience, and you get through it, but just barely. And in the midst of that, you could probably use some support. You could use somebody that can help you see God when you get a little too offline, if you will. Healing, I've kind of touched on healing, but the confession and the healing, or there's also another kind of healing, of course, just the physical healing. I broke my arm a couple years ago, and with it, I remember thinking not just my arm crumbled, that was the word the doctor used, my wrist crumbled, but a lot of things in my life crumbled. I really needed my spiritual director to kind of speak into my life, to remind me who God is, to help me recall what God might be up to. So healing, some physical healing. Surrender is another topic that I see frequently and hear frequently. If you want a funny example, well, not funny as much as kind of sad and ironic, there's one in Jeremiah, the 38th chapter, about what surrender can look like when God calls it forth. My life has told me that it's typically cross-culture. And so again, when we're called to live differently than our culture, it's good to have someone who can keep you at that kind of prophetic edge, keep you listening to those deeper things of God. Grief is a big one. Whether it's grief of losing our parents, grief of the COVID situation, there's grief here. They call that ambiguous loss. Grief of the dream that's died, as I spoke of earlier. complex grief. Those things are beautifully brought into spiritual direction in another heart and life that can listen with you. Maybe you are suffering from great temptation. Maybe there's an attachment that just hounds you and you want to get some help there, get some insight that maybe you don't have. There's also something that happens in our spiritual journey that's called liminal space. Middle space is another word for it. Ambiguity would be another word for it. You know, as a culture, we're not really good with stuff that doesn't really fit left or right. But a lot of life is right there in that messy middle. And that's great stuff for spiritual direction. Maybe you just need encouragement. Someone to say, you've got this. Go. God is with you. And then lastly, one that I've seen is people that are in what I call forced exile. Maybe a marriage has fallen apart and you're being forced into exile as the ex-spouse. Maybe there's been tough stuff in a family situation and you are in a forced exile from family of origin. Or maybe you were adopted and that feels like a forced exile. Those are the things that a spiritual director can listen and help you see where God is when you might be saying, I don't see God here at all. So that's the gift of spiritual direction. Some churches have them on staff. That's fabulous. I think that's a great model. And then other churches maybe encourage it, encourage you as a parishioner to come and find one. So there's some resources here on my YouTube video. There's a beautiful website that's got a lovely search tool. You can put in kind of your parameters, what you're looking for, man, woman, age, denomination, and it will give you a list of several that are either in your area or available virtually, which is of course so easy to do nowadays. So thanks for listening. I just thought I'd try to flesh out this ancient tradition that I'm part of, this ancient call. I've had people say, what is it? How does it work? My other YouTube on this topic talks about how it works in the room, how long the sessions are, that type of thing. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. It is the greatest work I've ever done. I'm delighted to be part of this. It's humbling. It's also at times frightening. But anyway, thank you for being here. Consider hitting like and or subscribe. Both of that helps. And I just pray that if you feel drawn to this in your life, that this is something you need. I pray God brings you to the person that will fit with you. That's another piece. Discern that the fit is good on both sides. That's part of the process too. So thank you. And may this encourage you in your journey, in your transformation with God. Bye now. Thank you.